Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby, and this is my podcast. Covert agendas in spirituality, coming from a lot of buried anger. Not always buried anger. It's not every helper or teacher is an anger repressor, but there's a lot of us. And I was, as you guys know. A lot of non-dual teachers are. They will never admit it. You can question them. Their denial of the whole thing is your answer. Just when they say, oh, don't worry about that stuff, that's just coming and going, or whatever they say, there's your dismissal that repression does to stay safe. But see, how would you know that? See, I'm talking about something that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's true. So it's not a conspiracy theory. Unless we say, well, most conspiracy theories are true, and I don't think we're ready to go there. But this is like a set of covert agendas that are necessary and have to be there with anger repression within a helper or teacher. These are things that have to be there. They're not choices, like they might be there. No, there has to be a need for safety and love that's coming from deep within the body if there's anger repression. And I'm going to focus on anger repression, although I could do a podcast episode on the repression of vulnerable emotions and how that creates a kind of grandiose narcissist in teachers and helpers, but that's not this. This is the covert, shall we say, narcissism, but people don't like that when you start throwing that word out at people who are good, peaceful, helpful, kind, or nice. Agreeable even sometimes. Easy to be with. Labels on those people, see, as an anger repressor, I was protected. Because as I showed up energetically as good and peaceful, people felt bad about saying bad things about me. And that's how anger repressors protect themselves, by showing up a certain way, which is self-protective, like a trauma response, to hide the buried anger. And when you're a teacher or helper, you're not aware of this. But you just show up energetically a certain way. That's what I was doing. So you have to watch for that, because nobody's going to announce it. No one's going to say, okay, I'm going to help you guys. I'm going to teach you, but I have buried anger and I need your love and approval. But we're not going to focus on that. Even though that's driving it, we're not going to talk about it. I just wanted to announce it. Okay, here we go. That's not going to work. Nobody does that. There's so many social rewards in being an anger repressing helper or teacher or therapist. So many. Because you can be a good listener. You don't rock the boat. You might be, very direct or clear around certain things, but you're not going to be authentic. Can be driven by a need for love and approval if there's anger repression. That's going to be infused in the whole thing. That's actually really problematic if you sit with it for a second, that someone that just has a different repression is helping other people who have that same repression, or the opposite, or somewhere in the spectrum. If you can, let me explain this for a second, because I think this will clear this whole talk up maybe. I see life as energy, or I feel it as energy. I was a so-called empath, just like so many of you, sensitive kid. It was always about energy. But after doing repression work, all my energy is online. And I'm conscious of all the things that were unprocessed. The fear. I'm not saying I'm done. I'm just saying the work that I did. So now, it's still energy for me. Completely more so, actually. Because my life force is online. The anger repression is, I did that work. So that's really important in this, because if you hear me from a mind thing, or from just minds, from the mind, because I talk a certain way, you won't hear it that it's energetic for me, but I'll still have to talk. So on one end of the spectrum, there's buried anger. It's like buried power too. And it's like a covert thing, because what appears at the surface is like good or peaceful or kind or helpful. See the covert nature of it? Because that's the duality right there, guys. The number one duality is within ourselves. Look at this covert aspect of certain people that have buried rage, buried power. They show up as good, small, peaceful, whatever. See that duality? That's it. Once we end that duality, the rest of it is fine. Go to that duality created by repression. And look at the other end of the spectrum where it's the opposite. And you have someone who buries the small energy, the vulnerable emotions, and shows at the visible level big energy or anger or dominating, even grandiose, as extremes here. See that? But that's a duality. If a person has to hold back vulnerability, then they only feel safe showing the opposite of that or something that's not that. Same on the other side, which is the more covert side. Because you don't notice it on this anger repressing side. But the overt side, like the grandiose side, it's more noticeable because it's bigger energy. These teachers and helpers get into trouble more on the overt side, the grandiose side. They're not all grandiose, because that's really unfair to say that every helper or teacher who still has some hurt or sadness repression is a grandiose narcissist. That's like is just too much as saying that every anger repressing teacher is a covert narcissist. I'm just saying covert and overt are patterns of energy, how we show ourselves. It's the best I can do. See, the overt folks get in trouble more easily. I won't name names, but they're the ones who it's like, oh, there's an expose on him. Did you read it? That teacher? Yeah. Or that, like, they might act out in big ways, like crossing boundaries or sexual abuse or whatever. More likely to do that than maybe at the other end of the spectrum, the ones that are good and peaceful and such, who bury the rage. So they might not engage in the crossing of boundaries in the same way, but there's all kinds of boundary crossing going on at the covert side. But it's mostly emotional. It's not sexual or physical. It's just having no boundaries, overextending, codependency, rescuing, fixing, saving, having energy around that, and just having no boundaries, no authenticity. And it's the same, in my view, as the other end of the spectrum, but which is just more overt, and the boundary crossing is sometimes more physical and sexual. That's all. And it doesn't break down as people are one way or the other, because there's everything in between. But if you see it that way energetically, there's a duality there too. See, if we're going to live in real non-dual, like wholeness or embodiment, like real consciousness, embodied consciousness, I think we have to look at these deeper dualities. The one within us, which is I hold anger back. I have to be something opposite at the surface. That duality has to collapse within us through repression work, because the repression's creating that false duality that we show to everybody. To me, that's if there's any kind of narcissism on either side, is that we don't have to go there, but if we were, it would be the manipulation part. Because on the covert side, look, you have to give up that you're good and peaceful and kind. You have to give that up as an anger repressing teacher or helper. If you don't give it up, that's the manipulation, because you're getting something out of it. Love and approval and staying safe. But on the other end, the grandiose, they have to give that up. They have to give up the holding back of their vulnerable emotions and only showing charismatic, positive leader or whatever. You have to give that up, because that's harmful too. I've harmed people on the covert side without boundaries, and then from anger repression, and there's codependency. It's just as much harm, really, as the more overt stuff. It's just there's social rewards on the covert side. If you help more, if you cross boundaries, if you overextend, that just makes people who you help love you more. It doesn't teach them to trust themselves, though, and to discover their true authenticity, because you, the helper or teacher, are not acting from your authenticity with anger repression. In my view, a helper or a teacher would always have boundaries. And boundaries aren't what they sound like. Maybe it's your authenticity. I don't see how it could be any other way. I can't imagine a helper or teacher without boundaries, because I lived without boundaries. we know that there needs to be boundaries on the overt side because there's a crossing of the sexual boundaries. There's even some on the, see, it's just a spectrum. It's all over the place. But if you look at energy, of course we need boundaries on both sides. But on the covert side, where there's anger, repression, the boundary crossing is so covert, and the agendas to stay safe, get love, approval are so covert that it's going to take us a while to penetrate through that side of the duality. It's just so massively pervasive in spirituality and in the helping fields. But practically nobody talks about it. Some people do. For sure, codependency. But it's massive repression. Nobody's really talking about that enough, that the helpers are repressed. The teachers are repressed. And that's the we space that we talk about here in KI. And this is not boring. I hope you don't think so, the we space, but I'm going to tell you about it before this podcast is over. It's a big part of the covert. So Dan and I had covert agendas like so many helpers and teachers because we had anger repression. We weren't the sexual boundary crossers. We were the emotional boundary crossers. Codependency. He was even codependent with me, or, I helped him in a codependent way at one time. So we've been through it. We've developed work to wake up out of it because that was suffering. No matter how much love and approval we were getting, or I was getting, that suffering, I had 2 diseases. Even the suffering is covert on the covert side, if you watch. Suffering itself can be very covert. Like you might have a disease and not know it's coming from buried hurt, for example. That's covert. But on the covert helper teacher side, you notice a lot of teachers announcing that they're getting sick, like I did, or have chronic pain. But the disease itself or the pain is covert because, and how many times do teachers actually go look at the science and then check to see if their disease is coming from buried anger? And if they don't address that issue, there's a covertness to that, but they're sick. Like when I was sick, I didn't want somebody to tell me it was emotional because I had a self-defense around that. That's what repression does. It protects itself. And I know that saying when somebody's sick, like a teacher or helper, that, hey, it could be trauma, it's very triggering for some people. But this work wouldn't have been developed if somebody didn't trigger me. I was convinced, as the covert side often is, that I wasn't operating on any unprocessed, buried anger. I was just helping. I was teaching. What a crock of shit. Because I got something out of that. Many social rewards, actually, by believing that and not getting to the buried anger. So when my husband and Dan both suggested that it could be emotional, my chronic pain, yeah, I didn't like that. Any more than any teacher or helper who's an anger repressor would like this podcast episode. Or others who have anger repression and who help people. Unless you're really open to get to the root of things. And I wasn't until this work was developed out of necessity because I basically wanted to kill myself. That's where my codependency went. My anger repression went to chronic nerve pain, suicidal ideation. And then I just let go of the whole non-dual teacher thing the way I was doing it. That was part of the transformation to get out of that hole, is letting go of the idea of things arising and falling to awareness because only safe stuff does. That's a dead framework for me. A very, frankly, dangerous one because it's part of the covert agenda to keep things buried. And that was really harming me, that framework of, that's what I call first dimension. That's why I do the dimensions, because there's this risk to not seeing the covert nature of what's going on in these dimensions. So the covert is not an intentional thing, and nobody has in first dimension teachers who are with anger repression. They're not plotting and planning to harm people. It's not like that. But first dimension is just teachers and practices that just make awareness and noticing things coming and going, whether it's mindfulness, forms of meditation, resting as awareness, non-dual pointing. But they don't dig below that. They don't ask an inquiry question that prompts something up into awareness. It's like the be with what is style. Now, it's fine, but see, the refusal to go into the unconscious from there is a problem for me when I hear that, because that refusal was my refusal, my resistance to seeing if I had these agendas. And so, but us teachers, we can like rephrase it, like a relabel our resistance and say, well, don't go digging for trauma. There's really nothing there. There's nobody there. Or, yeah, that can just be endless. See, there's an agenda there to stay safe and maybe even continue to get love and approval. Like, keep coming to me. Don't go to the buried stuff. I never did. I didn't see this in myself. When I was a first dimension teacher, wrote 7 books. Thankfully, there was some second dimension inquiry in there just to kind of save those books for me. But there was a refusal in that first dimension pointing and practicing, where it's just like, don't worry about the buried stuff and all that therapy and any kind of processing and the fact that you're driven by trauma, forget it. There's nobody here. It's all one. Get over yourself. It's empty. What are you doing? See, first dimension is just often, it's a teacher, for example, who wakes up to presence. It's not been embodied. They're still afraid of what's buried. They don't know it. And so they're teaching from within this limited box. And there's a refusal that nobody can see because it's covert. It comes across as a pointer or a sleight of hand sort of instruction not to do something and just to do what the teacher is telling you to do. And then you're in the box. Then you can't explore the unconscious because you trust the teacher enough to be there and listen and not say no or question the teacher, which is a sign of repression, where we couldn't question mom and dad, afraid of what we might have to feel and express, but we couldn't. So we can get trapped in these dimensions and trusting teachers in it. What is their agenda? It's repression's agenda. It's safety. But it's never mentioned. It's unconscious. I didn't know it was there when I was writing those books. It was driving me. It's buried stuff. You only see it at the visible level if you're trained or if you've done the work to see the refusal to go into second dimension and third is driven by something. It's not just wisdom. There's a limitation to it because we now know that trauma is buried in the body and drives suffering. So to say we're not going to go into the body is to stay away from the root of suffering, which brings us to second dimension. So that's just prompting things up in awareness. We're talking about covert agendas. So once we get over that covert agenda not to do second dimension, and I finally got over that bias against the unconscious exploration, but it didn't go deep enough. And that's the issue with second dimension. It has an agenda to still stay away from the buried stuff. It's being driven by the repression. It all is. So at second dimension, it's like a consciousness exploring, but not getting to the root because the root is driving the exploration still. The unconscious is driving everything, which is third dimension. It doesn't have those agendas at all. KI doesn't have those agendas in first and second dimension to stay away from what's buried. It goes right to the root of them, which that's where the resistance comes up, though, for us. For all of us, because the agendas are for safety in our different practices and meditations and therapies. Until we get to the buried stuff, we're driven on managing and seeking safety and love and approval. It's a cold, hard fact that you just have to stare at. It's in your own body. It's not, if you go into your body, you'll see it's not up for debate. It's programming, driving us. You can debate it, but it just keeps you safe. It's hard to break through the agendas because you can't see them. They're covert. They're often driven by anger and other repression, but anger repression is a great example of how people wouldn't want to go feel that and don't even know they have it. And part of the agenda for the non-dual teachers is to say this sensation here is just a sensation in awareness. Now think about this covert agenda here. that a teacher wouldn't know they have. They're a non-dual teacher helping people explore the nature of reality, the non-dual nature. But the programming for that is buried in that sensation that they're just calling a sensation. Unless that teacher goes in the second dimension and starts to find that there's more in that sensation and shows people that, then there's less of that covert agenda to not explore. But then, are we just going to sit and do that forever? Because that becomes an agenda. Because people keep coming back, we're going to sit there and explore somatic things and pull things up. But they're all safer than the buried stuff in third dimension. And that's how that agenda or that bypass goes on in second dimension. And I was doing that too. I've done all of this. That's why I can point it out. You don't know you're doing it because you're just staying safe and getting love. And everybody's staying safe. And we're talking about awakening, but there's this massive bypass that's running through everything. And everyone's involved. It's a we space, which I'll get back to. But these dimensions are helpful just to see the covert nature of teaching and helping and where it comes from and how we avoid the buried stuff that we finally get to in KI third dimension. Now, I'm going to keep this under 30 minutes. We space is, to me, another felt thing. It's all energy for me. So we space is relationship. And to me, awakening is all relationship and body or unconsciousness. Now, it's not recognizing presence. That's a natural thing that happens as you explore the root of suffering and see that you're not any of the stuff that the repression mechanism creates for safety. You are the presence, as the teachings say. But we don't want to jump there because that's the agenda. See that? To stay safe and get love. I mean, you can, but I'm inviting you without agendas around any of that. My agenda is to come do this work. That's my agenda, and I'm transparent about it. And I also make money, but not a lot, but hopefully always enough to pay my bills. There's my agenda. I don't want your love and approval. I've done that work. In third dimension, there's no agenda there. You don't trust me? That's another thing with helpers and teachers. In third dimension, they'll definitely say, don't trust me. Trust yourself, and they'll show you how. And then you can just trust yourself. I'm just telling you that I dropped my agendas, and I had to do that because of the we space. Because as an anger repressor, as I started to discover that my repression was a control mechanism in relationship. It wasn't just buried anger. It was the root of suffering. So anger repressors can have very covert agendas, even in relationship. We can be controlling, and like our poutiness or our tears can be, I don't want to say crocodile tears, but a trauma response or coping mechanism coming from buried rage that was never dealt with in childhood from rejection and hurt or humiliation, in my case, from bullying. But we space, well, in the simplest sense, we space just means if I have buried anger, I don't want you to get angry in this we space of relationship. That's an energetic thing. You know that from just being a person, that there's a we space energetically that if you bury hurt, you might have an issue with people around you showing vulnerability. You, as an anger repressor, you might have a problem with people in their we space expressing, feeling anger. You might be drawn as an anger repressor to people who also repress anger. There's a we space that happens in teaching and helping. There's a codependency there that's hard to see, and covert agendas to stay safe and get love and approval from each other because we're not getting to the buried stuff. It's a very strong pattern in spirituality and helping, if you just heard that. But the we space has gotten so much more robust in this work, me and Dan, developing it. Because although it started as just a way to see that, hey, the repression in my body is trying to control my partner and his anger. And I didn't know it. And it's producing all suffering. I didn't know that. So you discover that in the we space of relationship as you do this work. You see, oh, this is how I'm creating suffering, and I'm doing this to people. And you take responsibility for creating suffering. It doesn't mean you become a nice person. Or that's just the trauma response again. It just you develop into what you really are. you become conscious. You're your authentic self. These are words. But the we space developed from just that, just recognizing repression is a relationship thing, and that we can work with that in practice. 2, actually there's a we space with helpers and teachers helping people. And that's what I've been talking about. There are covert agendas and overt agendas. More obvious energy, more hidden energy, and conditioning that's driving things. See, on Netflix, you're only going to see basically the overt side of things, the grandiose, maybe even psychopathic. But those are like, special cases, because there are a lot of teachers who are not psychopathic. They have empathy. They bury vulnerability or sadness or hurt. They show up a certain way. Some people are psychopathic. But the Netflix documentaries are not going to be about the teacher who's very loving and compassionate, who buried rage and led a bunch of other people into sickness and chronic pain later in their years in life. That's not going to be a documentary for a while. But it's the same scandal. And frankly, even the ones on the overt side, if they don't get to repression, are part of that too, because the bypass is that big. Repression drives things on both ends of the spectrum. There's the big dualism right there, is repression is driving our lives, our teachings, our practices, until it isn't anymore. And then what that looks like is a different we space. And that's what we're doing with KI, is a different container or we space with boundaries, but just really clear about, here are all the agendas. Can you see these agendas? And can you see they come from repression? And can you finally put to rest the constant need to stay safe from what you've buried and open to what you are? But that's a full body experience. That goes all the way. It feels good to put that podcast out, this episode out, because I've been meaning to do that. And I wanted to keep it short, and we're at 27 minutes, and I said 30. I don't care if I hurt people's feelings. I'm done with that. This needs to be called out. I don't care if I lose people. I think people have wanted me to continue just showing up a certain way and not criticizing things, because they were bonded to me because of that trauma response that I showed on the covert side. And maybe they had some of that repression too, and they weren't being real either. There's the trauma bond. But I can tell you that no matter how you see what I'm doing, I'm more than... I can't imagine being more satisfied and happier with my life and where I'm at and this teaching and my transformation. I couldn't imagine, but I think it's just going to get better because it's just gotten deeper and deeper, because repression is like that. And what that allows us to do is hold everything, including even the criticisms that people throw at us, as we discover our own authenticity and break out of these covert and overt patterns. And so then what happens is something to me is beautiful, and it brings back in the non-dual. I criticize the non-dual bypass because I love the traditions, and I think we should keep them relevant. We should keep this subject relevant, and I want to by bringing in the middle way here from a perspective of the unconscious, which is when you actually make conscious the vulnerable emotions that you bury, that are responsible for the stuff on the overt side, and you make conscious the anger, aggression, or whatever else that you bury on the covert side, you're a full spectrum, whole human being. You're not good or nice or big or bad. You're a full spectrum human being. You have all of that in you. You could say you're none of that, but don't want to cop out, because you're all of that too. And you really see it, though. And it's an embodiment process. It's not just, I'm not this or that duality in my mind. That's the mind manages safety, and processing the mind keeps us safe from the buried stuff. So I'm saying the duality that's in our body, if you can really feel this, there's a middle way, and it's just authenticity. That's why I've been talking about authentic self-realization, because I think it's possible if we spot these agendas on both ends, see where they're coming from, process them within ourselves, however they show up. All we're doing is removing the blocks to what we really are. If you're interested, you can take the somatic test that tells you what you've buried. We keep it at repressiontest.com. When you take that test, take notes, and then you'll be on our newsletter. Just keep watching for things that we send. Jump into a live call with me or somebody. Just listen to us. You can only get on these live calls if you're on our newsletter. I think we call them on-deck meetings. I don't look at the title. I just pop in the meeting. Toshi comes in, Dan comes in, and other trainers come into that meeting. So repressiontest.com gets you on the newsletter. But I always put in the description for these podcast episodes links to services you could just start right now. You can start mentorship, 7 days, I think, is the one I'm going to put there. And then you can just do it learn the work on your own, at home, in the comfort, and away from everyone else. So can I just tell you something before we go? Because this is part of the covert thing. Oh gosh, you know what? I'm going to spend just a few more minutes telling you this, because you guys want to hear this. And then I'm going to let you go. Because this is why we have a do-it-yourself course, which is, the link is in the description. Let me tell you the story behind that. It's all about this. So I've said recently on YouTube in shorts, the 3 signs of an avoidant spiritual path. And teachers and helpers, especially with buried anger, are contributing to this avoidant pattern. But nobody calls them out, except for me. I mean, others do. But some call themselves out, actually. But this avoidant spiritual path shows up as what I call it, as like a disconnection in relationship. You know, coming from emotional repression, you can't feel and express what's true to your loved one. So there's a disconnection, separation. And then find a mistress. There's the second sign. It's a pattern that keeps repeating. The mistress could be a person, like you're cheating on your partner or something. It could be a fantasy. It could be a path or a practice, a method, a teaching, which does not get to the buried emotions. In none of those scenarios, either the cheating on with the person, the fantasy, the path, the practice, if none of them get to the buried emotions, they're all safe. So the avoidant pattern that is disconnected from relationship attaches to these things, these mistresses. And then the bypass or the avoidant pattern continues. And then the third sign is just rinse and repeat. It's just because we don't get to the buried emotions and to our authenticity, either with this new love interest that doesn't know who we are, we're not authentic at all, or a fantasy, which is just a fantasy, or a practice that doesn't get to our authenticity. It doesn't matter. It serves the purpose of the trauma conditioning that disconnected us in relationship. So we have to repeat the whole thing. That's the third sign. Now, where teachers and helpers come in, and the do-it-yourself course, is we will step in as a mistress, unfortunately. Because if we don't get to the buried emotions, we're not unlike anything else that's a mistress. So that we're part of your avoidant pattern. We may not own that, but we are. And so our responsibility is the we space, how we're interfacing with you when you're in an avoidant pattern. And what we know is that we can help people in the avoidant pattern because that's repression. But they're not going to want to come and work with us. And we have to be careful how we're interfacing with all people. You know, but avoidant folks, we have trouble getting them into mentorship because of that avoidant. They don't want to be seen, especially at this level, the buried emotions. So we create this do-it-yourself course for people who have that pattern, who can just avoid the mentorship and learn the work through this recording. Now, the reason that's important in the avoidant spiritual path is because what we're going to show you is that's a mistress. KI is a mistress if you use it to bypass. So people with an avoidant pattern who do not do mentorship are more likely, we have seen, to bypass because their system seeks safety. So when they pick up KI, even though it was designed to get to the pattern, their system will use it as a mistress to bypass. All they need is like a session or two or a short mentorship to get on track so that the pattern can stop and suffering can end. But the avoidant pattern, the conditioning doesn't want that. It wants to stay safe and get love and stay in the disconnection at the unconscious level. That's why KI works at that level, and we do that through mentorship or the do-it-yourself course. So there you go. Thank you for listening.